let's get straight into the lockdown riots in the UK. This is really disturbing stuff. Boris Johnson has lost all control. As we spoke here on Outsiders last week, he seems to have lost the plot completely. But let's have a look. Rita, tell us about what is happening in London at the moment.
Well, they've arrested over 150 people, including Santa Claus. If the kids are listening, I'm sorry to inform you of that. But what was really quite disturbing was the way police handled this. It was quite heavy-handed in certain circumstances. And you contrast that with earlier in the year where during the pandemic, BLM were protesting and the police took a knee. Some of members of the police actually in London took a knee in solidarity with that protest. They were very much hands-off and respectful. But as you can see from the footage, very different attitude, and there's a lot of concern now about this two-tier policing. So if it's BLM, it's an anti-capitalist, anti-police movement, yes, they'll take a knee and behave themselves. But if it's a anti-lockdown movement, then they get out the truncheons and go nuts.
Well, I mean, isn't that what it's about now, Rita? It's not just a two-tier policing system. It is an entirely politicized policing system. This is exactly what we've seen in Victoria, in jurisdictions around the world. We now have a police force that is very happy to enforce the left's love of lockdowns, and where Boris Johnson is on this, I have no idea. But then
he's obviously been watching Dan Andrews, been going,
but when you've got, remember the footage that we had a few months ago? The police running away from the crowds of BLM protesters and having to put hoarding up around Winston Churchill. So the left is now in control, and now the left has got tacit control of the police force because the police are letting them run riot and do what they want. But anybody who wants freedom and individual rights and some sort of preservation of their dignity in the face of lockdowns that Boris Johnson now says will go through Easter of next year, which is insane, the police are completely doing their job.
Well, let's have a look. We've got one here, a guy being arrested.
What are you doing?
So there's about a dozen police officers jumping on the one bloke, and there was even more coming in. Heavy-handed, it's hard not to look at that and go, is that really a proportionate response, particularly from what we've seen in the UK?
And particularly, sorry, just one more point, we've got all of this vaunted talk about a second wave of coronavirus cases in Britain, but what we're not seeing is a concomitant rise in deaths. So this second wave actually seems to be a lot less dangerous than the first one, and yet they are still stuck in this mindset that they were 6-8 months ago. It's very, very scary.
Well, there's going to be next week, there is going to be a challenge in the Commons. So there's about 100 Tory MPs are actually really unhappy with what's happening. So we're going to see that in the Commons. It depends whether Labor sides with Boris. You might end up in some weird system there. Boris is in a lot of trouble. The problem that they have is these different tiers, these levels within Britain. They've got the same problem you had in Victoria, where out in the sticks, out in the countryside, there is no coronavirus, there's been no coronavirus, and yet they're being forced into these terrible lockdowns. So now the big debate is, do they reduce the tiers for their different rural areas and make just the cities lockdown, which of course has all sorts of other complications. But the heart of this and the real problem with this entire British lockdown thing, which you didn't have in Victoria, is the NHS, the National Health System. And what has happened, the objective of what Boris Johnson is trying to do, wait for it, is not to stop the coronavirus, it's to save the NHS. In other words, to save a bureaucracy. So all this pain and punishment and, as you said, left-wing enforcement is to save the bureaucrats. That's all it's about. It's despicable.
And it is the fundamental question here, not just for health services, but public services around the world. Who works for whom? Do we work for them or they work for us? And the entire bureaucratic response around the world in the West has been to make us work for the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy gets to sit at home on their Zoom calls. Everybody else goes out of business.
Well, Boris Johnson is apparently terrified that it's going to be Italy repeated, that there will be the NHS will be unable to cope over the British winter, which we're heading into. But, of course, that means that it's the NHS that can't cope. That's the problem, that you don't solve that by locking down the entire state.
Joys of socialised medicine.
Exactly. Yeah. Socialised medicine does not work. There we go, and that's been on the cards for years.